Hello, thanks for that introduction. I am not from a business background and I've learnt a lot today, but I also inhabit a world that's probably very different to yours. The discussion that we had earlier where Natalie was talking about Lend-Lease and some of her thoughts on how we should organise offices to facilitate teams working together, they're not really the questions I think about day to day. The question I think about is whether or not I have a desk for our staff. So I want to talk about Green Connect, but probably the first thing for me to do is to talk about social enterprise generally, because I imagine there's a lot of people in the room who aren't familiar or overly familiar with social enterprise, and I think there's a lot of businesses at the moment who call themselves social enterprise, and that can make it confusing. So the first thing to say is that really social enterprise is driven by a social mission. So usually in response to an existing social or environmental problem, social enterprise uses business as a tool to address a problem. So it is the motivating factor. So obviously through trade, we've got the trading activities themselves, but also the income and the reinvestment potential. That is a tool that can help us achieve social impact. Before I talk about Green Connect itself, I actually need to talk about the community in which I live. The business I run is based in Port Kembla and Warrawong, which are among the poorest suburbs in Wollongong, and Wollongong itself is quite a disadvantaged community. So what you can see there is the steelworks around which those communities developed. So we have a massive migrant population who essentially moved to the region to work in the steelworks. We also have coal mines. Again, we had a big migrant population who moved to the area for those industries. And both of those industries have gone through massive periods of mechanisation, which has meant less and less and less jobs. So Wollongong now often has the highest unemployment in the country, and Port Kembla specifically at last census was 11.2% unemployment. Warrawong was at 17.8% unemployment. So very high rates of unemployment because of our history. I wanted to put that photo in for contrast though, because Wollongong's also an amazing place to live. There's an incredibly strong community, which often gets overlooked, but also it's a really physically beautiful place that's also gone through a period of industries that also mean environmental degradation. So on a local level, Green Connect exists to tackle that problem, unemployment. And I think probably most specifically, I should say, we're actually home to a very large resettled refugee community. So Wollongong has the highest regional resettlement community, and is particularly a regional resettlement community for women head of household families. And we also have extraordinary problems with youth unemployment. So generally everywhere in Australia where you've got unemployment, youth unemployment sits at roughly double. And I said before, Warrawong has an unemployment rate of 17.8%. So you can imagine what it looks like for young people. And nationally, when it comes to resettled refugees, 5 years after resettlement, only a third of resettled refugees have a job. And that's nationally, let alone in a community where we already have high unemployment, and let alone in a community where we've got a very large resettled refugee population. The second problem we set up in response to is actually the problem of waste. And that sounds strange because actually waste doesn't seem like a problem in our day-to-day lives. You put something in the bin and it goes away, but it doesn't. So most of our waste ends up in landfill, and in Australia every year we're generating 25 million tonnes of waste that is just sitting there. Now this is environmentally problematic for a number of reasons. The most obvious is that it's sitting there leaching methane into the air and it's taking up space. So landfill is a massive problem in Australia, and actually governments are now legislating to charge fees to take things to landfill because this problem exists. The second environmental problem we set up in response to is actually conventional agriculture in Australia. So very high mechanisation, high levels of isolation, so often we've got single farmers working enormous properties, which leads to social problems. High pesticide, fertiliser use, which are degrading soils, and of course we can't produce food unless we look after our soils. And probably the last and most obvious thing to say is that our food travels enormous distances to get to us. We don't grow food where we live at the moment. And the last is kind of a hybrid of the two, which is food waste. So food waste seems like an extraordinary problem. 4 million of those 25 million tonnes I mentioned of food waste is generated in Australia every year. Food waste is actually needed to build our soils, but at the moment it sits in messy piles in landfills and produces methane. So these are the problems we set up in response to. Some obviously are national and global problems, and some are very local problems. So we set up a social enterprise called Green Connect, and essentially we work across several areas. First, we work in resource recovery, so recycling, composting, education around this, to essentially keep waste out of landfill and to turn organic waste into soil. The second is that we seek to improve soil and grow chemical-free food where we live. Now, each part of that process is actually very jobs rich, which is in part why we do it. And so we use this to create jobs for resettled refugees and young people. Now, just to explain the value proposition in this, obviously there's the social value and the environmental value, but the proposition to customers beyond you're helping achieve a social and an environmental outcome is that at the moment where you spend money on waste is transport. So we produce lots of waste, we don't try and curb the amount of waste we produce, and then you spend money for someone to pick it up on a truck and then you pay tip fees. That's where we spend money on waste at the moment. Our proposition is instead of doing that, spend that money on people to keep that waste out of landfill. So it's a very simple proposition on that front. Obviously there's also the proposition that we need to improve soil. So Australia has incredibly poor soils, and actually to mention one thing without getting too technical, we've got a big problem when it comes to, it's called phosphorus, rock phosphate. So it's an essential mineral for growing food. At the moment, traditional supplies, which is rock phosphate, are being rapidly depleted. We're actually going to hit peak phosphorus, but phosphorus is present in food waste. So rather than mining that rock phosphate, bringing it from overseas and putting it into our soils to grow food, we can put our food waste back into our soils and grow food. And the last thing to say is obviously instead of, again, spending money on transport for our food, we should spend money on people growing that food where we live. So that's really the proposition, is that actually we're putting the money back into people rather than into machines, which is the model that we've moved towards. And because of those enormous distances, it's actually got a financial, you can actually do it with price parity. Oh, and just some photos of us at work. So we do everything from waste management at events and for organisations, helping keep waste out of landfill, to waste audits, so looking at people's waste and how they can reduce waste. That's a picture of our farm. Now, you probably wouldn't even at first look at that and think that that's a farm, but we intensively farm a small plot of land, and it's chemical-free. It's a chemical-free farm. Now, this is quite an interesting space in that this is a partnership with a local high school. So we lack for, it's often come up today, we lack for capital to set up. But what we did was partner with a high school who had land that they could not manage and weren't using. And they've given us that land at no cost. That's actually a partnership with the Department of Education and Training. And we farm that land and we employ kids at that school who are young people at risk. So that partnership makes all kinds of sense in terms of an unused asset that was actually a cost for the school to manage that we're now using to grow food where people live. And that's just one of our staff who've come through the high school, obviously growing food. Now, the last thing we do, and this is, oh, that's a very dark photo from here, is we're making compost. So we're collecting food waste and making compost. And the reason this is so interesting is that food waste in terms of government at all levels in Australia is a massive problem, and one they keep saying they want to do something about. But what's happening is investment is going into research around high-tech solutions that are actually incredibly expensive to run, when composting is not complex. We're using methods that have been used for hundreds of years, and it's actually a fermentation process that, look, about as high-tech as it gets is our bobcat and our truck, where you can actually process food waste where people live with very little odour because we're not using some of these other processes. And that is something that isn't being done anywhere near enough of in Australia. Now, since mid-year last year, so I'm doing this by financial year, we've employed 107 resettled refugees and young people. We employed 122 people in total, and that gives you some idea of our rate of disadvantaged, and we would say not disadvantaged, staff. We've provided over 1,000 kilos of food to the local community, kept 196 tonnes of waste out of landfill, and covered 84% of our expenses through trade. So that means about 16% of our expenses at the moment are being covered through grants and donations. Obviously, we've got an aim to do all of it through trade, but I think what's interesting about our model is that we get the outcome at every point. So we don't just do some environmental good and hope to reinvest that money employing someone. Through doing that environmental good, we employ someone, which means the social outcome is happening at the same time. Now, I just thought I would actually, given the crowd who are here today, talk about some of the problems that we face, because they're probably the opposite problems you have in many senses. But I think important first to go through the lessons and then some of the problems we face. The first for me was that employment pathways are not enough. So when we first established, we thought, right, one of the main barriers to employment for resettled refugees is getting their first employment experience in Australia, knowing what expectations are around work, whether it be cultural, training, etc., getting that first thing on the CV that means they can then go and get a job. And again, when it comes to young people, particularly young people who come from a family where there's a history of unemployment, so one of the single biggest indicators of whether or not you'll have a job is whether or not your parents had a job, that through working with these people, they can then move into further employment. The problem is when you work in a community where there are not enough jobs, there aren't any jobs for people to move into. And so what we realised is that we cannot just be a pathways organisation, we actually have to be a creator of jobs, which actually says something about us needing to scale up. The second, and maybe this goes without saying, but is being taken seriously when you're a social enterprise, that you actually know how to run a business. And it's astounding sometimes, one, people don't say it, but two, how little confidence people have that you can run a real business if you're in social enterprise, or you're doing it to achieve a social outcome rather than value for shareholders. Now, I time and time again meet people and tell them what I do, and it's incredible how many people say to me, oh, that's lovely. And I think, well, it is. Look, what I do is lovely. It's also really hard work. But that's not the point. Actually, we're a very serious organisation, we're innovating, and I should have taken a moment longer to talk about that composting, but that is something Australia needs. And no one is driving on that at the moment. But because we are a social enterprise, it's incredibly difficult to know how to launch that at scale. And so one of the biggest challenges we found is being taken seriously as a business. And we can't seek funds through conventional channels. We don't say, invest and I will give you this return on your dollar. The investment is a social return because you want to see that change happen in our community. The next thing I would say is I've had to chase a lot of funding through more conventional channels, and really a trap for social enterprise, I think, is writing applications for the funding rather than knowing what your business is, where your business needs to go, and seeking funding on that basis. Now, that's perhaps not something many of you would come up against, but that's been an enormous lesson for me, to not write an application to meet someone else's outcome, because we actually are very clear on what we need to achieve and how we need to do it, and I need to go after funding where people are going to put money into the project as it stands. The next one is actually more a lesson through the experience of working with different government and government-funded services, and that's that our focus needs to be on outcomes, not outputs. And I'll just give an example to explain this, because that's not always incredibly clear. We often work with what are called Job Service Australia providers. So if you live in Australia and you're a job seeker and you're a recipient of Centrelink payments, you will have to have a Job Service Australia provider, and that provider is supposed to help you find a job. You are funded by government, and your funding is linked to enrolling people in training or getting them into a job, which sounds fair enough. That sounds like a fair enough output if you're being funded to do that. The problem in our experience is that one of our staff will come in and say, my job service provider has told me I have to do this course. And we'll say, okay, well, do you want to talk about the course? Do you not want to do the course? And they'll say, no, I've already done the course. I did this course with the exact same job service provider. I completed it. I've graduated. Now they're telling me I need to do it again, because their funding is contingent on that person being enrolled in a course. To give you another example, we get lots of people who come to work for us who have a very particular high skills base. It could be an Iranian refugee who was an engineer who comes to Australia whose qualification is not recognised, or who hasn't yet got the English language skills that mean they can go and work in a workplace in Australia. And the Job Service Australia provider will say, I've got a security guard job for you. Not, this is how you're going to retrain as an engineer and do the job you're trained to do in Australia. And so that's been our experience, where if you simply look at the output, you're not actually going to know whether or not you're helping someone. So we actually go through a process of when people come to us, learning what it is they want to achieve, where they want to be headed and how we can support them in getting there. And then that changes over time. The last thing I would say is that, or maybe this one has two parts, we can only achieve what we are because of our team. So we have a team who is on the same page in terms of our goal. And really everything else flows from that. So obviously you have to build in the skills base that you need around that. But actually the main thing is, because sometimes we come across things we don't have the skills for, but if you're convinced of what we're trying to achieve, you find a way to get that information or knowledge or upskill because you're committed to the outcome. And so we really have a team, I believe, who's driven on that basis. And the second part to that is say this is only possible because of the community that we're in. So we're not in a farm in Warrawong doing what we're doing without the support of our community. It's because that school is convinced that we need employment in our community, and that's why they're part of it. And so what we are doing is only possible for that reason. Now, just to finish on what I think are our biggest challenges going forward at the moment, before I end with a comment on some of the people we're working with. The first challenge for us, I think, is that we are not a charity and we are not a business. So we don't fit into people's previous models, and that's incredibly difficult. So most funding bodies have quite bureaucratic processes, actually, and including government, about the boxes that you need to tick. And social enterprise doesn't fit because organisations historically who have funded charity don't see us as a charity. We're trying to upscale to be a business, to pay for the outcome in a sustainable way. But that actually doesn't fit most people's model. And so that's a real challenge for us, actually finding people who want to invest in the social outcome and are convinced of the way forward that we're presenting. The next one I would say, and really this is partly flows from the next, is resources to scale up. Now, obviously that could be funding, but that can also be partnership with other organisations in our community. So without naming names, for example, right now I am talking to a number of businesses in Wollongong who have idle land because I want to do composting on their site. Now, this is land they are not using. It would be at no cost to them. It's not going to be of any financial gain to them, but they would help achieve this outcome in our community. And so we need resources, both financial but also non-financial, because there's a lot of large organisations essentially with idle assets. The next challenge, and this is a challenge but it's also why we do what we do, is having a mission based on job creation is incredibly difficult when labour costs are the largest cost in any organisation. So if you aim to create jobs, how do you cut costs and increase your rate of profit? It's actually a constant conundrum, and we do everything from thinking about the kind of food we grow on our farm, that we will necessarily plant things that have high labour intensivity and high labour intensivity everywhere. So if you grow something like raspberries, they have to be hand-picked wherever you pick them, and so crops like that are good for us. But it also presents a whole range of challenges, particularly financial challenges. And the last, which is of course not unique to social enterprise but maybe unique in the way that we experience it, is competition. Obviously, so we are largely entering new markets, creating new markets in Wollongong, but that doesn't mean other people won't do it too if it's a good idea. And so that's the biggest risk for us. If we don't scale up, then we will likely have other people come in and do what we're doing, and do it without the social outcome. So that for us is obviously a big risk, and we're really navigating that at the moment. And I think that question around resources, both financial and non-financial, is crucial to us addressing that question. Now, what I wanted to finish on is really why I do what I do. So I just wanted to read a couple of quotes. I'm sorry I don't have a video, from some of our staff, because it keeps me doing what I'm doing. But maybe this is my sales pitch to you too. I'll start with the quotes. This is Emmanuel. Emmanuel lived in a refugee camp in Uganda for 7 years, recent arrival to Australia. He's one of the assistant supervisors with Green Connect. He said, "As a new arrival in a new country, you don't know how everything works. At Green Connect, I've begun to learn about Australian culture, and I've got better at working with other people from different backgrounds. My English, my fifth language, has also improved. It has given me the courage to know that as a new arrival, I can work and earn money." And to read my next quote, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of Remember, although I always remember Remember's name, because the first time he introduced himself to me, he said, "You will not forget, I am Remember." So Remember actually went into a refugee camp, a Togolese refugee. He went into a refugee camp when he was 15, and he lived there for 19 years in Ghana. He said, "Green Connect find me a new job. I've been doing hard work for them and they appreciate it. It changed my life. Now I'm feeding myself, no more Centrelink. Now I'm a person that gives back. I like it very, very well. It's a better life." Ooh, I made myself teary. That's why I do what I do. Oh. And the last point I wanted to make, which is really my pitch to people here who might be considering social enterprise or partnering their business with a social enterprise, is that I think actually the master of innovation is necessity. Is not just necessity in terms of business, but because you can make the world the way you want it to be, that innovation can be an incredible tool to make life better for everybody. And that is really why I think we've had the success that we have. Thanks.
I'd love to say that's lovely. A lovely story. That was actually a really, really interesting story and a great example of innovation, I think, on so many different levels. Can I just ask a question? What are the jobs that you create? What are the roles? The roles.
So they're quite diverse, actually. First, at events, we've got a combination of jobs, and this is often the first job people have with us because you don't need a lot of English language to do it. So one is looking at the waste that comes through the bins and picking out any contaminants. The second is actually acting as a waste educator. So you stand at bins at an event and you actually talk to the community about how to recycle your waste, how to compost your waste, which councils are very interested in because people are getting it wrong at home, and if through their large public events they can have people do that, that educates community at home. We've got people farming, obviously people farming and people running our composting. But lastly, and Emmanuel, whose picture is still on screen, where he is actually about to drive for us a program of bringing volunteers, a network of community volunteers in around our organisation, because we're having enormous difficulties in all of the support that it actually takes to work in a job. So obviously we offer direct employment support, but if you're getting kicked out of your house, or you're getting kicked off Centrelink, or you're stuffed up on your paperwork, or you don't know what superannuation is, or you didn't file your, and the list goes on, you actually need people in the community who are willing to walk you through that process. And so we've actually asked him, his background is in social work, and we've actually asked him to work with people in our community who want to come in around our staff and support them in the ways that we don't.
Fantastic. Right, any questions for Jess, or suggestions actually about how to address some of the challenges? Yes.
Not a suggestion, force. I love exactly what you spoke about. My name's Tim Allen from Australian Red Cross. You said that the challenge, one of the challenges you had was the perception of it being a business or a charity. My question for you is, what do you think you are?
I mean, I think we're a social enterprise. I just think it's a really misunderstood or unheard of term. And I think, sadly, government is notoriously slow when it comes to innovation, particularly innovation in the social space. So they're really hesitant to back social enterprise. And really social enterprise, like any business, requires startup funding. And so I think for a few years, I was sort of writing grant applications and getting bits and pieces of funding in around what other people wanted to achieve. And I'd sort of find a bit of our business that we could develop in that way. But my lesson has actually been not to do that, to find the people who actually want to partner with what we do, few and far between as they might be, but that's what's actually going to make the project work.
Are you aware of any other social enterprises that in other regions of Australia you work with, or you can share your knowledge and basically maybe adopt some of their business models as well?
Yeah, probably two really worth mentioning. The first is called the Bread and Butter Project, and it's actually based in Sydney. So it's also a refugee employment project that was started by the Burke Street Bakery. And they employ refugees as apprentices through their training to become bakers. And so from them really learning some of the support we need around our staff, and we've been working with them a little bit. And the other is an organisation called Resource Recovery Australia. So they're actually a national organisation that works with community recycling enterprises to help them develop to become viable businesses. So they've been really wonderful and supportive, and in particular helping us bringing our composting online.
Are you able to comment on your vision of where you want to take the business? So you commented on these two other organisations, and I commend you what you've done. And I suppose with my hat on, I'm thinking this is wonderful in terms of the social good for the whole of the country that we could take across the country. So the question to you is, what's your vision in terms of at the moment it works in Wollongong? Yes. So the question is, can you transpose your model? And yes, it is a business model. Yeah. Could you transpose that is the question. And what's vision, I suppose? Two questions.
Yes, so our mission is actually to do this so that it works, so that it can be replicated. So lots of schools have idle land, there's lots of space. We need to be composting in urban areas, we need to be growing food in urban areas, and these are jobs-rich industries. So we are documenting everything that we do, which is very hard when you're a resource-constrained organisation, because this needs to be replicated. The second, in terms of, well, maybe next steps, I mean, for us, I think, is composting on a serious level. So one of the biggest problems when it comes to food waste is that in most council areas, you can't put food waste in your green bin. So at the moment, you either have home composting or you put your food waste in your red bin and it goes to landfill. So you just don't have the option. And what we need to do is set up a facility that's large enough that means we can have compost going into the green waste bin and we can compost it. So it's actually, you can actually save money doing it, because at the moment you don't have the same tip fees if you do that, and particularly if you do it where people live, you knock out the transport, but it also creates far more jobs than a stinky pile of mess in a landfill.
You know, I think in Adelaide they have the separate food waste bins. And in London.
That's because we're ahead of you lot.
And it's such a good idea. They've got little, and you just put your food away. Is that right? Do you, Pete? Is that, yeah, you do? That's absolutely. Yeah.
Only in certain council areas, not possible.
Yeah, so the most notable that I've been to is actually Armidale. They've nailed it. Like, their whole council area, people can put their food scraps in their bin and they process it all on site, and residents can come and pick it up as compost for their gardens. So it's a fabulous program. What I think is the huge challenge is doing this in an urban context. So Armidale's very different, much smaller volumes of food waste, much more space, greater proximity between your landfill and your residents, but cracking this in an urban context is essential, and that's what I think needs to happen next.
See how Adelaide's doing it. Yeah. Any other questions? We have got a bit of time.
Good question. What about organisations like Oz Harvest in terms of their business model and how they've grown? Is that something you're talking to in terms of logistics? I would imagine it's one of your biggest problems.
What do you mean is that biggest problem?
Well, in terms of how do you... First of all, there's big business waste, hotels, restaurants. Yeah. What are they doing with their waste? And then also, it's how you're actually going to collect domestic waste and make money from the composting.
Yes. Well, that's two questions. So there's actually some ridiculous barriers when it comes to collecting food waste for reuse. So largely because of the laws around food and packaging, it makes it incredibly difficult for someone who has food waste to get it to someone who needs it. So Oz Harvest are doing a really great job of that, but we've really not gone down that path. We actually work with people more around not having food waste and then composting the food waste that they do have. Sorry, what was your second question?
Just in terms of the logistical challenges of picking up domestic waste and to you.
So I think we're not in the pickup industry In fact, you need extraordinary infrastructure to be in the big trucks and facility to be in the pickup industry. But I'm very interested in the processing side of it. So obviously pickup has to happen, but there are already providers who are doing that. What doesn't exist is the processing of organics to get them back into the soil.
Okay, thank you very much.